Welcome to, I think it's lecture 117 of our Mor Nevuchim class. Today, I'm going to read chapter 32 of part 3 of the Guide for the Perplexed. And the chapter 32, I read parts of it way back in the beginning when I was still thinking about kind of jumping from piece to piece rather than reading straight through. Like the first couple lectures. But this time we're going to read it beginning to end. And for those that are still with us from back then, I don't know how many there are, but for those that are, it'll make much more, everything makes much more sense when we have the background of having studied for several years together. But even if you're new, I think I see some new people tonight. It'll still be extremely wonderful. So I'm reading, any page number I use is from the Shlomo Pinas edition of this book here, volume 2. And we are right now on page, I think it's 525, chapter 32. And as we know, Rambam is teaching us the reasons for the commandments. And he finished the last chapter 31 telling us that all of the commandments, he says, can be divided up into one of three categories in terms of their reasons. Either they are teaching us something true, teaching us what the Pinas translated as opinions. In other words, they're teaching us a true idea, the idea that, the monotheism, the unity of God, for example, that's an idea, right? It's not a behavior, it's an idea. Or it's teaching us a moral quality. It's teaching us how to be a better person. Or it's teaching us political civic actions. It's teaching us to act in a certain way that leads to a better situation for society. And that order is backwards in a way, because what the Rambam explained to us, that the reason for those mitzvos that create a better functioning society is in order that there should be peace, prosperity, health, in order so that we should have the ability to improve our moral qualities, in order that we should be able to then contemplate ideas, which is the ultimate goal of it all, is to be able to reach intellectual truth, is to perceive truth. So the bottom line is that all the mitzvos are for us to perfect our intellects and to learn everything there is to know about God's world, and in as true a way as we can possibly attain. So here we are about to start the chapter 32. One of the most difficult things to understand, if you remember, especially coming off Rambam's long speech, 2 chapters ago, about the crazy things that what he called the Sabians used to do, right? The idol worshippers. And the Rambam kind of poo-pooed all these sacrifices that they used to bring, which, automatically, and I think somebody brought this up, well, what about the sacrifices that we were commanded to bring, right? Which a whole section of the Torah is devoted to sacrifices and their rules and so on. So how does that work? Like, what's the point of that? How does that fit into any of those three categories, right? The Rambam just told us it's not political civic actions, according to our translation. It doesn't teach us moral qualities. It doesn't teach us good opinions. So how does it fit? So the Rambam's going to get straight down to business and tackle one of the hardest questions right away. And that's what chapter 32 is devoted to. So if you consider the divine actions, I mean to say the natural actions, remember, right? In other words, how does science work? How does biology function, chemistry function, physics function, right? The deity's wily graciousness and wisdom, as shown in the creation of living beings, right? In other words, remember, in the Rambam's time, the idea that things evolutionarily developed, right, in response to the needs that the environment presented to them, was not how they thought of things, right? They thought of things as people were designed and creatures were designed in order that they should fit into that function. It's a teleological way of thinking, as opposed to they learned to function because they had to survive in this atmosphere. So the Rambam is saying, if we look at the world and we see in the gradation of the motions of the limbs and the proximity of some of the latter to the others, will through them become clear to you, right? You'll when you examine, let's say, for example, a human being and how he's put together and how this is connected to that and this serves to function this way and that way and so on, it automatically become obvious to you how incredibly wise God was, because if his intention was that we should be able to see, so we should know where we're going and get to where we need to go and not bump into things we don't want to bump into. So then the eye was perfectly designed in order to achieve that result, right? So similarly, his wisdom, you'll find this idea come up in almost all the medieval thinkers, in the Chovot HaLevavot goes into this in depth. So the Rambam is really just saying something that was said by all the thinkers in the time. Similarly, his wisdom and wily graciousness. And wily here is used, and it's not meant to be derogatory. It's like sneaky. It's meant to be, just really smart and cunning, as shown in the gradual succession of the various states of the whole individual become clear to you. The brain is an example of the gradation of the motions, the proximity of the limbs in an individual. So don't expect to get the knowledge on modern neuroanatomy from the Rambam right now. Just understand the point that he's making, though, is an important point to this day, right? That the functioning of the brain it's so incredibly complex and so incredibly perfect to fulfill its function, and that's the point. So its front is soft, very soft. The posterior is more solid. The spinal marrow is even more solid and becomes more and more solid as it stretches on. And then the nerves are the organs of sensation and of motion. That was discovered by Galen, by the way. I know Galen had done experiments on monkeys where he slit the spinal cord and then they weren't able to move and sense things like that. So this is stuff that in Rambam's time it was well known. So accordingly, the nerves required only for apprehension by the senses or for motion that presents but little difficulty, like the motions of the eyelids and the jaws, proceed from the brain, whereas the motions required for moving the limbs proceed from the spinal marrow. Like I said, don't expect this to correspond to modern neuroanatomy. Just the point being that all these complex connections, as however it is impossible for a nerve in view of its softness, even for a nerve proceeding from the spinal marrow, to move in articulation, the matter was wilily and graciously arranged as follows. The nerves are ramified into fibers, the latter having filled with flesh. He was talking about how anatomically they had already known at this time that the nerves seem to enter into a muscle and then kind of spread out into the muscle. We obviously understand that neuromuscular junction on a very complex level, but what they saw was the nerve entering and then kind of becoming the muscle, right? So that's what he's describing right now. So thereupon, the nerve having overpassed the extremity of the muscle, having become more solid, they're thinking of it as the nerve now became stronger. It turns into like a tendon or so on. Having overpassed and having been commingled with fragments of ligaments becomes a tendon. The tendon joins it here to the bone, and thereupon, because of the gradation, the nerve is capable of moving a limb. So now this nerve makes the limb move, right? Okay? You can understand why someone in this time would think of anatomy this way, and that's how it was. The point is, even the Rambam is saying, I'm not giving you a neuroanatomy lecture. The point is, I mentioned only this one example to you because it is the most obvious of the wonders explained in the treatise of the utilities of the parts of the body, and which is one of Galen's most famous. I don't know if it's supposed to be pronounced Galen or Galen. I heard it both ways. If someone could tell me which one is correct, to let me know. I've always read it, but I never really spoke the word to anyone. So I always read Galen, but then I hear people saying it's supposed to be Galen. So if I'm pronouncing it wrong, please forgive me. But anyway, so but Galen I've mentioned him several times because Rambam quotes him all the time. Galen was I think 3rd century Roman physician / philosopher who basically was and he made many incredible advances in medical knowledge, but also he set into motion what became medieval medicine all the way until the mid 1600s, when true modern experimentation started happening in the world of medicine. So for that entire swath of history of about 1300 years, Galen was basically medicine, right? The humors and Galen had all kinds of ideas, and Rambam's medicine is strongly Galenic medicine. Okay, so anyway, all of which are wonders are clear, manifest, and well known to those who consider them with a penetrating mind. Similarly, the deity made a wily and gracious arrangement with regard to all the individuals of the living beings that suck, right? For when born, such individuals are soft and cannot feed on dry food. Accordingly, breasts were prepared so they should produce milk with a view to their receiving human food. which is similar to the composition of their bodies, until their limbs gradually and little by little become dry and solid. The idea being that a soft baby needs soft food, a hard, solid adult needs hard, solid food. These are ideas that were common in the medical discussions of the Rambam's time. Anyway, the point being, right, the Rambam is saying is that if you look at all of these incredible biological functions of a human being, you can see how God designed it in such a way that the person should be able to have what he or she needs in order to function in the environment that he or she is in, and they should have the food that they need in order for the particular body type that they have, et cetera, et cetera. Bottom line is that the function of the things that we see of creation, right, were designed perfectly for their purpose. Okay, so now if God is giving us the Torah, right, so then one would imagine, and if you think what Rambam is saying here, we can again learn from the world, learn from science, how God would function if he's going to give us the Torah. So the Torah, according to Rambam, is a guidebook to teach us how to create the best possible world, right? He said to make a society that works and functions properly. So the laws and rules and guidance that's given to us in the Torah must be just like science, in the sense that this is the perfect way for us to build a society that functions properly, that will eventually result in the ultimate goal, which is that people should strive for spiritual growth, which in the Rambam terms means intellectual knowledge, knowledge of truth, right? So then the rules of the Torah should also do the same thing, okay? So many things in our Torah are due to something similar to this very governance on the part of him who governs. May he be glorified. And I'm just turning the page to 526 at the top, exalted. For a sudden transition from one opposite to another is impossible. Rambam is making an observation from the growth of one particular organism, one human being, and looking at it and making it and drawing a much more broader conclusion to a social construct. If you're taking a group of people, just like a baby needs to start with soft food and then eventually go, or just like the nerve starts off soft and then eventually gets harder and harder as it gets closer to the bone, in order to do what it has to do, a society can't just jump from soft to hard like that, right? You can't just, and if you think about it, if you try to come to a society, if you go to a primitive society and all of a sudden give them a cell phone and they're still on foot, and they haven't even invented the wheel yet, what are they going to do with the cell phone, right? They're not going to know what to do with it. They're going to maybe use it to try to eat with it or something. They're not going to, right? You can't, it's not going to work, right? You have a long way to go from point A all the way to point Z, right? So you can't just take society and throw it at them, right? So give me just 1 second. I'm sorry about this. Just I have to answer a really quick message. So it doesn't work that way. So, and therefore man, according to his nature, I'm still at the top of 526, is not capable of abandoning suddenly all to which he was accustomed. As therefore, God sent Moses, our master, Moshe Rabbeinu, to make out of us a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That was point Z, right? That's where God wants us to get to, right? He wants us to get to the point where we're a nation of priests and a holy nation. But how's he going to get us there? Through the knowledge of him may be exalted accordingly to what he has explained, saying, unto thee it was shown that thou mightest know, and so on. Know this day and later the day of that where we receive the Torah and receive the truth. The point being, because God wants us to get us all the way to that lofty goal, right? So that we should devote ourselves to his worship according to what he said, and to serve him, and so on. And he shall serve. And as at that time, but God's coming to a people that are not quite there yet. They're very, very, very distant from being a holy nation, of being a nation of philosophers like the Rambam, right? Of nation of people that spend that a society that is such that the poor are taken care of, the sick are taken care of, the people are honest, people aren't stealing from each other, violence is no longer a threat, peace reigns upon the world, so that people can sit down and actually work on finding truth and knowing truth and understanding God and so on, which is the ultimate goal according to Rambam. And as at that time, the way of life generally accepted and customary in the whole world and the universal service upon which we were brought up consisted in offering various species of living beings in the temples in which images were set up. That's how people approached spirituality in those days. They would take creatures and offer them up to these gods, right? In worshiping the latter and in burning incense before them. The ceremonies, the incense and the and the worship, the song and dance and everything that was included in the prayers that they were doing in these idolatrous temples, right? The pious ones and the ascetics being at the time the people who were devoted to the service of the temples consecrated to the stars. So then God, when God is coming to give the Torah to people, that this is the world they live in. This is what they do. This is how they approach spirituality. They approach spirituality in a temple with a sacrifice, all of the pomp and circumstance and the solemnity of sacrificing an animal and the seriousness of it all and with the incense and the wine and whatever else was going on, right? So his wisdom may be exalted, and his gracious ruse, which is manifest in regard to all his creatures, did not require that he give us a law prescribing the rejection, abandonment, abolition of all these kinds of worship. God therefore didn't come and say, don't do those kinds of things. If you want to approach spirituality, don't do it that way anymore, right? You're not allowed to bring sacrifices anymore. The Rambam is hinting that that's really what the goal really would have been. God isn't interested in that, right? But he realized, right, I can't come and tell them not to do that, for one could not then conceive the acceptance of such a Torah. Considering the nature of man, which always likes that to which it is accustomed, people would never have been able to accept it upon themselves. They never would have been. Well, the concept of spirituality that God wanted to teach them was so far from them that they wouldn't have been able to handle it. They couldn't switch from here to there in such a dramatic way in such a short period of time. At that time, this would have been similar to the appearance of a prophet in these times, who, calling upon the people to worship God, would say, God has given you a law forbidding you to pray to him, to fast, to call upon him for help in misfortune. Your worship should consist solely in meditation without any works at all. Now, I see what Rambam is hinting here is what Rambam believes the true purpose of prayer is not the fasting. It's not the saying the exact prescription of prayer that we say when we go to synagogue, the way it's laid out in the siddur and the prayer book, right? To do this, you say this first, you say that second. We do this responsibly. We sing here. That's not what God wants. What God wants us is to spend our time contemplating, and meditating over the truth of the universe, right? But if God would have told people, don't pray to me, I'm not interested in all that stuff, right? It wouldn't have been accepted because that's not where people are. Therefore, he may be exalted, suffered the above mentioned kinds of worship to remain. God said, you know what? I'll let them continue in this mode of worship, right? However, but transferred them from created or imaginary and unreal things to his own name. He said, you know what? Do it, but do it to me, not to, go through that ceremony that you're using now to access spirituality. Do it, but do it with me as the one you're worshiping, not those idols as the ones you're worshiping, ones with a small o, right? Commanding us to practice them with regard to him may be exalted. Thus he commanded us to build a temple. That's the whole reason why it did it. Why did he say to build a temple? What's the point? Why did God say build a special building for me, right? And let them make me a sanctuary, to have an altar for his name, to have the sacrifice offered to him, to bow down and worship before him, and to burn incense before him. And he forbade the performance of any of these actions with a view to someone else. He that sacrifices unto the other gods will be destroyed, and so on, right? You can read several quotes. I'm now at the top of 527. Because of their employment in the temple and the sacrifices in it, it was necessary to fix for them dues that would be sufficient for them, namely the dues of the Levites and the priests, right? So in other words, the responsibilities and that we have towards supporting the people who are going to be in the temple, to make sure that the service is appropriately focused on God and God alone and not on anything else, right? Through this divine ruse, it came about that the memory of idolatry was effaced. And Rambam is saying the proof is in the pudding, right? Because it worked, right? They built it. It took a while because while the temple was up, there were plenty of times that we went off the path and started bringing idols into the temple, all kinds of nonsense. But in the long run, with the benefit of with our retrospectoscopes, the temple and that whole sacrifice and all those things worked to bring monotheism into the world, right? Nowadays, you look around, the vast majority of human beings believe in one God, right? So it worked. It was a good plan, right? Through this divine ruse, that's how it worked. Namely, the existence and the oneness of the deity was firmly established, while at the same time, the souls had no feeling of repugnance and were not repelled because of the abolition of the modes of worship to which they were accustomed. So God was able to achieve that without getting people all riled up and upset about the fact that, oh no, now I can't do my usual sacrifice and bring the sacrifices like I used to, and then which no other mode of worship was known at that time. I know that I'm thinking about this, right? So now some of us might be thinking this, so you'll see that your soul will necessarily have a feeling of repugnance towards this notion and will feel aggrieved because of it. I'm saying, I know some of you are upset by what I just said, right? Right? So, Hank, I get it. Rambam gets it. I get some of you might have not liked that, right? And you will ask me in your heart and say to me, right? The way he says, ask me in your heart, it's like he knows 1,000 years later, like people like us are going to be sitting here and asking these questions of the Rambam in our hearts, right? And we're thinking, whoa, Rambam, wait a minute, right? Did you just say what I thought you said, right? So that's the thing. So you're going to ask me, how is it possible that none of the commandments, prohibitions, and great actions, which are precisely set forth and prescribed for fixed seasons, should be intended for its own sake? The whole Torah is full of all of these things. On Sukkot, you bring this amount of oxen and this amount of sheep, and on Rosh Hashanah you bring this, and on Rosh Chodesh you bring that, and on Shabbos you bring this, and you have to bring it exactly this number of sheep. And clearly, it's for its own sake. There's something inherently valuable in that. And you're telling me that the only reason why God wanted us to go through this whole thing, and the reason for all these mitzvot, is simply because he didn't want to abolish it because he was afraid that people weren't going to like it if he tells them to stop doing what they were doing, right? So, but for the sake of something else, as if this were a ruse. The whole thing is a giant joke. The whole Sefer Vayikra is just a ruse. It's a trick to trick us into monotheism, but all the laws about it is just a ruse, invented for our benefit by God in order to achieve his first intention. What was there to prevent him, may be exalted, from giving us a law in accordance with his first intention? Why didn't he give us a Torah that says, this is what I want? If that's what he wanted, why didn't he just tell us, this is what I want? Right? And from procuring us the capacity to accept this. And then if God is so afraid that we're not going to accept it, well, he can do anything. So let him give us the ability to accept it, right? He can change things about society and make us be more amenable to accepting such things, right? In this way, there would have been no need for the things that you consider to be due to a second intention. Then he wouldn't have needed to play this whole trick, and we wouldn't have had two temples, each one standing for 400 plus years, right? So we're talking about almost 1,000 years of human history where people are doing all this stuff, which is really not even the point, right? Just get to the point. So here then the reply to your question that will put an end to the sickness in your heart and reveal to you the true reality of that to which I have drawn your attention. And it is to the effect that the text of the Torah tells a quite similar story. The Torah, if you read the Torah carefully, you'll see the Torah was given to human beings, real humans living in this planet, on this world, with all of its wonders and all of its limitations, right? All of its beauty and all of its ugliness. But human beings have a certain nature, and that's the way it is. And God doesn't mess around with our nature. Everything he gives us is in response to the Torah is given to us as humans that live in human societies that have all of the limitations that human societies have. And you can see this in the Torah. It says, God led them not by the way of the land of the Philistines, right? Remember, this was the Yetziat Mitzrayim. So there was a shorter path. We could have went from Egypt straight through the land of the Philistines, straight into the land of Israel. But no, God led us all the way around through the Sinai, all the way around, right? Why did he do that, right? So God led the people by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. Because why? Because God didn't want us to get scared and run back, right? He knew it needed to take time. We needed time in order to develop into a nation, right? Just as God perplexed them in anticipation of what their bodies were naturally incapable of bearing, right? God didn't say, you know what, I'm just going to implant in them the mentality of nationhood that they need, so that they can just take the shortcut. It's much faster. The point was to get us to the land of Israel. So put us on a jet and get us there, right? Right? I mean, come on, like what's the thing? But no, but human reality is not that way. And God works within human reality, not, he doesn't control it or change it. Doesn't control it is whatever. You understand what I mean, right? So turning them away from the high road towards that which they are going, towards another road that was the first intention to be achieved. So did he, in anticipation of what the soul is naturally incapable of receiving, understanding that at that time people were not capable of receiving it, prescribe the laws that we have mentioned, so that the first intention is to be achieved. The ultimate goal is that he should achieve his first point, right? But it's going to take time, namely the apprehension of him. And what is the point? That we should apprehend and understand God may be exalted in the rejection of idolatry and rejection of any idea other than the idea of the unity of one God. For just as it is not in the nature of man, after having been brought up in a slavish service occupied with clay, bricks, and similar things, right? Remember, this people that he was taking out of Egypt, they were enslaved people. They were people whose minds had the slave mentality, right? They were busy all day just building blocks, being forced, and through. So all of a sudden washed off his hands from the dirt, deriving with them, and proceed immediately to fight against the children of Anak, right? Immediately he can now go and be a warrior and do what needs to do to conquer the land of Israel and settle it and build a new state. They weren't ready yet to do that. So it is also not in his nature, after having been brought up upon very many modes of worship and of customary practices, which the souls find so agreeable. People believe in this. This is how they grew up. This is what they do, right? This is how they worship. This is how they access spirituality. So, which the souls find so good that become, as it were, a primary notion, that they think this is how you achieve greatness. This is how you worship, right? That he should abandon them all of a sudden. And just as the deity used a gracious ruse in causing them to wander perplexedly in the desert until their souls became courageous, God made them wander around the desert. Why? Because by wandering around the desert, a whole bunch of things happened, right? They became courageous. Why did they become courageous? They forged a national identity, right? When you're a slave, as we saw in the people that fought with each other, right? Moshe, so they formed a national identity. We're dependent upon each other. We're out here in the wilderness. We need each other to survive. So they formed a national identity. They formed a history. They had a common experience that they worked through, and they had to work through problems. They had to together in order to build a society, so that by the time they got to the land of Israel, they were now ready to go and embark on nation building, right? But they weren't ready when they first walked out of Egypt. It being well known that life in the desert and lack of comforts of the body necessarily develop courage. It develops strong, when you go through stuff with people together, you come out a courageous and strong people. You need those challenges to build people. Whereas the opposite circumstances necessarily develop cowardice. If they're going to if they're just coming out of slavery, they end up being cowards, just like we see so many times throughout the wilderness. Let's just go back there. It was easier. Yeah, we had to work hard, but at least they gave us food at night, right? Until, moreover, people were born and were not accustomed to humiliation and servitude. The generation born in the desert was a generation of people that had freedom on their hearts, not humiliation and servitude. All this having been brought about by Moshe Rabbeinu, by Moses our master, by means of divine commandment. All the commandment of the Lord they encamped. At the commandment, and at the commandment of the Lord they journeyed, and so on and so forth. So did this group of laws derive from a divine grace, so that they should be left with the same thing, just like in the Midbar, just like there. God couldn't make it happen like that. It had to happen through a process. So too, the bringing people from the understanding from where they were in a world of idolatry, bringing them to a world of monotheism, bringing them to the ultimate goal, which is not sacrifices. The ultimate goal is the idea of contemplation of God's truth, right? And which is the Rambam's highest level where you can reach, right? The constitutes the first intention that should be validated in them. That's why God went through this process. There's a lot more. I'm not stopping yet. I just want to. We're like kind of halfway through the chapter. It's very likely that the things that are I'm sure bouncing in many people's heads are things the Rambam is going to address. So I want to. If there is someone that wants to ask something, go ahead. If not, we can let the Rambam do it. But what do anyone want to say? Okay, go ahead.
I'm not sure it's a question. It's more like a comment. Uh, Rambam, thank God, didn't live in our day and age. We are, at least this is how my rabbis pronounced it. We are the instant generation, and we fall for how everything is packaged. We
Uh-huh.
we can't we can't with our even though we are very smart, we can't, with our limited ability, to imagine what it
Hmm.
was like to be told that this will happen only in 40 years. Like, it's just,
Yeah.
we put things in the microwave and dinner is ready.
Right, right.
We don't know what it's like to labor and to prepare and I think that that's part of our problem today. Like, Rabbi Hertzfeld says that any organization today that has the word now in it is dangerous.
Right,
And he doesn't mean that they're bad. He just means
right.
that they're taking these behaviors and saying we know better than God. I, anyway, just wanted to.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah, but the Rambam is saying that there is no the instant answer is not human. It's not normal. It's not how society works. Things take time. To get people to a point where they can achieve their goal. And if you think you can, you're right. I think if someone gives you the instant answer, oh, just take this pill and it's all better. With maybe very few limited exceptions to the rule, they're usually pulling your leg, and they're selling you some snake oil. Um, yeah, and I think that's a good point. It's a very good point, and people find that hard to accept. I want to know now. What if I tell you you're not going to, and not only not you, but your kids and their kids still not? But if you start going in the right path now, then maybe your great grandkids might achieve the level where God wants us to get. I don't know how many people would be happy with that, but that's the way. That's the way it might actually be. We have to take steps in the right direction now, even if I'm going to step on a very kind of hot rod subject right now. But like you look at an intractable problem in the world. The first one that comes to mind, of course, is some semblance of peace and between Israel and its neighbors, right? And I'm not suggesting what the answers are, but I don't think anyone in their right mind, if anyone tells you this is the answer, and if we do this now, it's over, you know that they're just stupid. I mean, they're just stupid. There's people that do that though. Whether the answer is a very violent one or a very not the opposite, and whether it's from the right all the way on the right wing or all the way on the left wing, if they tell you this is the answer, then it's just wrong, right? But if somebody tells you, listen, if we take these steps and we move in this direction and we make these relations and we build these things and so on and so forth, then we can get to a point where in 5 years from now we might move it a little bit more forward, and then in 10 years from now we'll move it a little more forward. And if we stay the course, maybe we'll get somewhere, right? And I'm not here to to give political advice. I'm just I think this is really exactly what the Rambam is saying, and thank you for Yosef for bringing that up, because I think that's exactly the issue, that it doesn't happen right away, and God's not going to intervene and say, okay, human nature has now changed because I want to get to the end game. That God doesn't work that way. Human nature isn't going to change. So as for your question, what was there to prevent God from giving? I'm in the second paragraph on 528 now, in the middle of the page. What was there to prevent God from giving us a law? I've been translating law to the word Torah, which is more modern translations, do that, and the word law is the way Shlomo Pincus translated Torah. So I'm being more accurate. So anyway, in accordance with his first intention, and from procuring us the capacity to accept this, why didn't he just change human nature and make us be able to accept it if that's what he wanted? You lay yourself open to an inference from the second question. Because if you're going to ask this question, you're opening yourself up to a big problem, the Rambam is saying. For one may say to you, what was there to prevent God from making them march by the way of the land of the Philistines and procuring them the capacity to engage in wars? Why didn't, his example before, make them now have that national spirit and that courage that the Rambam said was so necessary for them to go into the land? Give them the courage, right? Give them the national spirit. Wave some pixie dust on them, and poof, now they'll be a nation of warriors and people, or heroes or whatever, right? so that there should be no need for this roundabout with the pillar of clouds and all the drama that happened in the desert, right? Also, you lay yourself open to a third question as an inference, but let's take it even further, right? A question regarding the reason for the detailing of promises and threats with regard to the whole law. What then would be the entire point of the entire Torah, the Rambam is saying? If God was going to change us in order to affect the end result, let's say if God wants us all to be tzaddikim, like he wants us all to contemplate the truths of the universe, right? That's not what the Rambam thinks, right? We should all be at peace with each other. We should all be helping each other so that we can spend our time in spiritual pursuits rather than playing the stock market or whatever it is that we do, right? So why didn't God just make us into perfect people? And then we just walk this face of the earth and we're all perfect because that's what God wants, right? Well, I mean, the absurdity of the question should become apparent to you, right? Obviously, that's the whole point, is that we should do the work to get there, right? Right? So one may say to you, in as much as God's first intention as will are that we should believe in the Torah and that we should perform the actions prescribed, why did he not procure us the capacity always to accept this intention and to act in accordance with it, instead of using a ruse? He puts us through this giant trick, right? We go through the world. Is there a God? Is there not a God? Is it true? Should I be nice to my neighbor? It's a lot easier. I could be a jerk right now. If I punch him in the face and I grab his car keys and drive off with his Mercedes, and now I have a nice Mercedes. So it's even better, right? But so why doesn't God just stop us from having desire for my neighbor's Mercedes, right? It would make it so much easier. Because the point is, we're supposed to learn how, right? Because so declaring that he will procure us benefits if we obey him and take vengeance on us if we disobey him. He's playing this whole game. You do the good things, you get rewarded. If you do bad things, you'll get punished. Like performing indeed all these acts of benefiting and all these acts of vengeance. For this too is a ruse used by him with regard to us in order to achieve his first intention with respect to us. The whole Torah, the whole life, our whole existence is a ruse, if you think about it, right? Then you could ask that, if all he wants is a couple of smart people sitting in a circle engaging in philosophic contemplation, then he should have just given us all a philosophy degree, put us in a nice big room, and have us contemplate, right? What was there to prevent him from causing the inclination to accomplish the acts of obedience willed by him, and to avoid the acts of disobedience supported by him, to be a natural disposition fixed in us, that we should all simply want to do the right thing all the time and make life easy? And then he would have accomplished it. So there is one and the same general answer to all these three questions and to all the others that belong to the same class. Though all miracles change the nature of some individual being, it may be true, right, that any miracle that happens, right, that's recorded in the Torah is a change in the nature, right? The nature of the sea is not the split, right? So the individual in that case would be the sea, right? And a miracle happened, the sea split. But God does not change at all the nature of human individuals by means of miracles. God will never, ever, okay? And if you're already trying to think of exceptions, hold off, we'll deal with them, right? But God will never change human beings by means of miracle. God is never going to say, I'm going to make that guy into a tzaddik or a great righteous man. I'm going to make that guy into an evil person. I'm going to make that guy. And so that never happens, the Rambam says. That's not something that God, you might find in the Torah places where God intervenes in nature in certain things. Like I gave the example of the sea, but you will not find that God intervenes in the nature of a human being, right? Because of this great principle, it says, oh, that they had such an heart as this, and so on. It is because of this that there are commandments and prohibitions, reward and punishment. That's why the world works the way it works, because there are consequences to our actions, and we need to know there are consequences. If we act properly, we'll have proper results, and if we don't, we'll have improper results. We have already explained this fundamental principle by giving its proofs in a number of passages in our compilations, right? In the Rambam, it's fundamentally in the nature of the world. If you do properly, if you go the right way, you'll have good results. And if you go the wrong way, you'll have bad results. That's how the world is made, right? We do not say this because we believe that the changing of the nature of any human is difficult for him. Maybe it's not that it's impossible for God. That's a silly kind of sophomoric philosophical question. Can God change the nature of a human being? Of course he can, but that's not the point, right? Rather, it is possible and fully within his capacity. But according to the foundations of the Torah, that's not how he made the world, right? Of the Torah, right? He has never willed to do it, nor shall he ever will to do it. It's not because he created the world in such a way that the whole point of the world is that he should not intervene. The whole point of the world is that it should run according to its nature. That's the world within which we have the tests that we have of our lives, right? His will that the nature of any human individuals should be changed because of what he may be exalted wills from that individual, sending of prophets and all giving of law would have been useless. If not for this, then the entire Torah would be completely useless. All the teachings of the prophets would be totally useless. All this whole thing, we should just, close our computers and go home and sit down and do nothing because there's no point anymore, right? Because God's just going to make you into a great man because you're sitting around doing nothing because he wants you to be a great man, right? So I return to my subject. So now let's go back to the subject of the korbanot, of the sacrifices. And I say that as this kind of worship, I mean the sacrifices pertain to a second intention, right? And a second intention meaning it wasn't the ultimate point, but it was meant to bring us towards the first intention, was just to get us to contemplate God without the means of sacrifices. Whereas invocation, prayer, and similar practices and modes of worship come closer to the first intention and are necessary for its achievement. So the Rambam is saying is prayer without sacrifices is a step closer in the right direction. Now, this might conflict with some things some of you have learned about in Jewish philosophy. The Rambam is clearly indicating here that where we are today is not clearly indicating, he just said it black on white. Where we are today, where we pray without sacrifices, is a higher level than our forefathers that prayed with sacrifices. And let that sink in for a minute. I didn't say it. Maimonides said it, okay? So we are ahead of the game because we're getting closer. We're not there yet, right? But we're getting closer, right? For one kind of worship, I mean the offering of sacrifices, even though it was done in his name, may be exalted, was not prescribed to us in the way it existed at first. I mean to say in such a way that sacrifices could be offered in every place at every time, right? It was done in order to bring us to the point where we are today. How? I'll show you. One of those ways is by telling us, you can't just bring korbanot sacrifices wherever you want, whenever you want, right? However you want, right? Doesn't work that way. It used to be when you had to go to the idols, there's 10 different idols, and you can say, oh, I want to bring 10 here, 5 there, 2 here. I like that guy. I'll bring 6 there, right? I can pray here. I can pray. No, that's not how it works, right? You only come here, because if you do that, then it opens up the floodgate to not learning the lesson you're supposed to learn. And that lesson is monotheism. The lesson is focusing on God and truth, right? So every time you go to one of these idols, you start thinking, oh, this guy controls the wind, and this guy controls the sun, and this guy controls the moon, and this guy controls so on and so forth, right? So so nor could a temple be set up in any fortuitous place. You can't even decide where to build the place to bring these sacrifices, God says. I tell you where it's supposed to be, right? Nor could any fortuitous man offer sacrifice. And you can't just decide, I'm going to do it. I'm going to tell you which people are supposed to do it, right? On the contrary, he forbade all this. God said no, right? In order, he said, there's one place, establish one single house unto the place which the Lord shall choose, so that sacrifices shall not be offered elsewhere, so that thou shalt not offer thy burnt offerings in every place that thou seest, right? Also, only the offspring of a particular family, only the Kohanim, only them, because this way it was an intent to ensure that the focus of the sacrifices should be in the right direction, on God alone. And by engaging a specific group of people, it was their job to make sure that that's how it would go. All this was intended to restrict this kind of worship. Everything you see in the Torah about the laws and the rules, remember the original question that got the Rambam off was, why did the Torah write all of these rules? It's not for the fact that they're important, right? In other words, you'd think that you're supposed to bring 7 korbanot on this day because 7 is some kind of special thing, and 7 is going to create all kinds of wonderful things. That it would no, right? The point was, this is all that I want you to do, because I'm going to tell you what to do. You can't just choose to do it randomly, because I want to make sure you focus in the right direction, right? On the other hand, invocation and prayers are made in every place. And we're going to add to this. You can't just bring a sacrifice, but it has to be accompanied by prayer. You have to have vidu. You have to admit your sins when you bring a korban. You can't sacrifice. You can't just bring it and think you're going to get everything's going to be cool now. It's all wiped out. No, you got to pray, right? You have to be humbled yourself, right? Otherwise, there's no point. You're just killing an animal for nothing. And by anyone, whoever he may be. This also applies. I just changed, I turned the page to 530. This applies to all of the things that we do when we worship. It applies to our tzitzit, the fringes that we wear, the doorpost, the mezuzah we put on our doors, and the phylactery, the tefillin that we wrap on our arms and our head, and other similar modes of worship. It's not going to happen if you just wrap it on your head or your hand, right? It's going to happen when you realize that I'm doing this ritual in order to focus on God. That's when you're going to have achieve the level that you're supposed to achieve. So just bringing a sacrifice is nothing if it's not accompanied by prayer. Because of the notion I have revealed to you, people are frequently blamed in the books of the prophets because of their zeal for sacrifices. That's why so many times in Tanakh, over and over and over again, the prophets criticize the people for being so excited about bringing sacrifices. It happens repeatedly over and over and over again. The famous one, and it's explained to them that they are not the object of a purpose sought for its own sake. God's not interested in your sacrifice. He doesn't want you to bring this little lamb and slaughter it because he likes lambs being slaughtered. That's ridiculous, right? Right? Rambam is saying now he allowed you to do that because he understands that that's the milieu within which you live, and that's how you approach spirituality. But that's not what he wants. And that's why Shmuel says, hath the Lord have great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in hearkening to the voice of the Lord? In other words, is he interested in your sacrifices? No, he's interested in you listening to him and doing and living the kind of life that he told you you're supposed to live. And Yeshayahu says, to what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices unto me? And Yirmiyahu says, I spoke not unto your father's son. These are all things, the famous quotes from all the prophets. It happens over and over and over again in all the prophets, right? That idea, is God interested in your sacrifices? No, he wants your heart. He wants your action, right? This dictum has been regarded as difficult by everyone whose words I have seen or heard, right? So many people have problems with Yirmiyahu, right? The last thing Yirmiyahu said, it's an interesting quote, right? For I spoke not unto your fathers, nor commanded them in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt, concerning burnt offerings or sacrifices. Yirmiyahu says, I didn't command them after coming out of Egypt to bring sacrifices. That's what Jeremiah says, right? So people say, what does he mean? How can Jeremiah say that he has given us no injunctions, no commandments concerning sacrifices? Seeing the greater part of the commandments are concerned with these things. Chapter after chapter is all about them. How could Yirmiyahu say, I didn't command you to do them? It doesn't make any sense, right? However, the purpose of this dictum is, as I have explained to you, what he's trying to tell us is the following. Is just what I was saying, right? He says the first intention consists only in your apprehending me and not worshiping someone other than me, right? In other words, I didn't command you when I brought you out of Egypt. I commanded you to learn about me. I commanded you to build a society and to live a life that leads towards knowledge of me. That's what I commanded you, right? I didn't command you to have sacrifices as an end of them in of themselves. I commanded you to live a life that will lead to the first intention, which is to me, God says, right? I will be your God. Hearken unto my voice. I will be your God. Those are the words, the ending of the verse in Jeremiah, right? And I will be your God, and you shall be my people. Those laws concerning sacrifices and repairing to the temple were given for the sake of the realization of this fundamental principle. The purpose of all those laws was in order to bring this out. The purpose of all those laws was not for those laws themselves, right? In so many ways, this is true about all the mitzvot, right? The ultimate purpose of all the mitzvot is to lead to the ultimate goal, which is knowledge of God. And that's really what the Rambam is boiling down to. And now the sacrifices, the Rambam put them into a scheme where even something which before we read this Rambam didn't make sense to us. What's the point of this? Well, it's all part of bringing us closer to God, which is the point. That's the first intention. That's the bottom line, right? Is for the sake of that principle that I transfer these modes of worship to my name. This is why I said, you know what? Don't bring sacrifices to all the idols. Bring them to me. So that the trace of idolatry be effaced. I needed to get rid of all of this idolatry. The fundamental principle of my unity should be established. You, however, came and abolished this end. What Jeremiah was telling the people was, you forgot the point. You got rid of the end, the point of this bringing to where it's supposed to lead, and you have doubted my existence, right? they have belied the Lord and said, "Is it not He?" Right? It is not He, and you have committed idolatry, and so on. And you continue to go to the temple of God and bring sacrifices as if that's the end goal, right? Which are things that have not been intended in first intention. That God says, "I never commanded you." That is not something that I wanted from you, and it's never anything that I wanted from you. I really want to finish, so I'm going to go and finish this chapter, even though I might go slightly over time. But forgive me. Right? I have another way of interpreting this verse. It too leads to the very same purpose that we have mentioned. It has been made clear both in the text, in the Torah, right, and the words of the prophets, and in the tradition, in other words, in Chazal, that in the first legislation given to us, there was nothing at all concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices, right? You ought not to occupy your mind with the carbon Pesach, right? For the reason for this is clear and evident, as we shall set forth. Well, you know what? This let me stop here because it's going to go a little bit of a different idea. So even though it's the last paragraph of this chapter, we'll have to do it next time. Let me stop. Give a few minutes for discussion, so we can have a few minutes for discussion. Again, this is one of the most famous, also most controversial for many reasons, many of which would be obvious, but one of the most important chapters of this section of Tamei HaMitzvot. So I'm going to open the floor. Fire away. Go ahead.
Sounds like, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, Martin, please, you go first.
No, it just sounds like Rambam would not think much of the idea of rebuilding the temple today, from what you've said.
Well, that is a very, very good point. And many people do conclude that from the words of the Rambam. In other words, or at least if he would rebuild it, that animal sacrifices wouldn't be part of it. The question though becomes, though, the Rambam in Mishnah Torah, right? The Rambam writes about the future temple as being and all of the temple sacrifices and service being restored, which is much more of a standard view, right? And so how do you reconcile those two things? So there's ways to reconcile it, but just for the purposes of today's discussion, I'm going to leave the question as a big question, right? It definitely is clear from the Rambam, and he said it straight out, that the ultimate goal is definitely not that, right? But meanwhile, we pray to restore the temple. So there's a lot of ways to try to answer it. Maybe I'll try to go into a little more depth next week into some of the approaches that people have had to reconcile that contradiction. If other people have suggestions, I'll take them. Go ahead.
I was just going to say exactly what Martin just raised. When we go to Jerusalem and we all go to the little museum where they're building, as you know, the replicas for the third temple. Should we raise this with the docent there, whoever guides us around? I imagine they're not happy with this thesis, but maybe they are after I've studied further with you.
Yeah, it's a hard subject. I mean, well, let me just say it right now. First of all, the non-Orthodox streams of Judaism hold on to this Rambam as a proof that, that not necessarily a proof, but support for their idea that the future temple won't have sacrifices. That we're not looking forward to reestablishing sacrifices, and it's a not an unreasonable conclusion from what the Rambam just said. But then again, when the Rambam talked practically about the future temple, he absolutely did do what's much more standard mainline in Judaism, in Orthodox Judaism at least, which is that it will be restored. So there's several ways of understanding this. I'm not trying to avoid the question, because I just don't have enough time in the next 3 minutes to really address it in a extensive way. But I think, what did you write in the chat? I'm sorry. Yeah. So Yosef is bringing up something which I was going to address in more detail, but the idea of the future sacrifices being only vegetable, right? Of being only minachot, right? So the Rav Kook is famous for holding this position. The famous Rav Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel, Ram Yitzchak Cohen Kook, and he has a lot of proofs. One of them being Arvala Hashem Minchat Yehuda v'Yerushalayim from the prophet Micah, right? I think it's Micha. I think anyway. So
Yeah, we say it every day after Shmoneh Esrei, right?
Yeah, and it will be sweet unto God, right? The mincha, mincha is specifically referring to mincha is a plant sacrifice, is a flour sacrifice, is a bread or a dough or whatever. So why did he choose to say in the future? He's in that prophecy. He's referring to the future, and he talks about it will be sweet to God the sacrifices that we bring, right? And apparently it's only the minachot, the plant sacrifice. There's a lot more than just that. That's the one that came off the top of my head. But that is Rav Kook's approach to this. I cannot say that has become accepted across Orthodox Judaism, but it is a very important one of the very important approaches. But again, there's more, so when we'll discuss them. All right, yeah, go ahead. I see that.
So Rambam basically said that prayer in the way that we do now is superior to sacrifice. Is that a good summary? And then I have a further statement. But
well, yeah, prayer the way we do now is superior to sacrifice, but there's a step beyond the prayer we do now, which is superior to what we do now, which is
that's where I'm going. So basically, we're going stepwise in a positive direction to get closer to God, to be able to get to God's truth. And
right.
my question, or my thought and question is, what is that ultimate type of relationship that we will have toward God or toward God's world, and understanding and appreciating God's world? What is that ultimate prayer service or whatever we're doing going to look like? Does Rambam reflect? He may talk about this later, and I just don't know. But the other thing is, it may be that the future temple will be in terms of that level of achievement of prayer or whatever we're doing to approach God, rather than even sacrifice. Sacrifice may take on a different meaning, and not the meaning that we're thinking of, but a more futuristic, advanced meaning that we use in the rebuilt temple, that is not the mundane sacrifice of an animal or even a plant or any type of sacrifice. We may be doing other things in the synagogue, or the temple rather, that are unrelated to things in the past, and that might be a future goal of what God wants us to do.
Right.
What do you think about that?
No, I personally think, and that what you just said is probably the closest to the truth, and I really like that, because that's really what I always thought. Like, I don't think we know what it's going to be, but I think that whatever it's going to be something that we don't really have the tools to we don't have a past really to compare it to, but it's going to be a relentless and pursuit of truth and knowledge in the Rambam's view, right? In other words, a place where everyone together works together to achieve greater and greater levels of knowledge of God through studying his world, his creation, right? And exactly how that's going to take place and play out, I don't know. I think we have little handles, on trying to understand how it gets there, but ultimately, can we imagine a world in which truth is the driving force behind all human interactions? Try to imagine. It's certainly not going on in 2025, right?
Not now.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. Just imagine where your sole goal in every conversation and every interaction that you have with other human beings, with the world around you, is real truth, not what you think is truth, not what you want to be true, not what benefits you, not the best kind of deal you can get out of the other guy, but actual truth is the sole driving value to every interaction between humans and God, between humans and each other, and between humans and nature around them. That's the kind of world that Rambam is looking at, and it's hard for us to imagine what it would be, what it would be like, Yeah. I think you're right, Billy. I think we still are immature, Definitely. I agree. And Rambam would agree. Maybe some people are still immature enough that they need the oldest ways, to approach God. But
Well, we all have a little flair of some of that from time to time. It's not a consistent throughout every person in every society, but there are pockets of this that sort of touch on it. Don't you agree?
Yeah, no, I do. I mean, the pockets that we're accessing in this class together are some of the good ones,
Yeah, so my thought is, what about this in putting in perspective for the coming of the Messiah?
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that. It's a big question.
It's a big question. Well, let's do this. Reflect
Ultimately,
on that.
I can tell you this is the goal of the coming of the Messiah. See, the problem is the phrase "coming of the Messiah" is connotes an image which isn't necessarily consistent with the way Rambam would describe the future days that were. Coming of the Messiah gives the idea. The word Messiah generally refers to a king of some sort, right? That's at least from Tanakh where it comes from. Coming gives the image of a certain person coming from somewhere, showing up in the middle of our community and somehow bringing about salvation, right? That is an image of Mashiach, right? And I'm not denying that such images exist. They do. But that's probably not how Rambam envisions the future days coming about, by some guy coming and to somehow everything changing. In what way do I think he differs? It's way too long for me to answer now, but I think you can kind of have a little bit of a handle on your own of what I'm talking about. Yeah, I see there's still a hand up, Jeffrey.
No.
Oh, it's not up anymore?
No.
Yeah, I would love to continue this conversation, but we will next week. We'll be finishing hopefully 32, and hopefully we'll be a little bit closer to truth next week than we were this week. All right, everyone have a wonderful evening.
You'd say thank you.
All right, you well.
Thank you, Saul. Thank you.
Yes, bye.